I never told my daughter about my $60,000 salary. When her husband said, "I'm ashamed of your poor mother. Let her leave," I quietly left. But a month later, I emptied their bank account and, good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Marlene Collins, and I was 64 years old when my son-in-law looked me in the eye and told me I was an embarrassment. I want to start before that evening, though, because you need to understand who I was before that moment and who I had always been, to understand why what came next unfolded the way it did. I retired at 61 from 27 years as a financial consultant in Portland, Oregon. I wasn't a wealthy woman by any spectacular measure, but I was comfortable. More than comfortable, honestly. I had managed my late husband Gerald's life insurance carefully, built a modest investment portfolio over the decades, and still took on 3 or 4 private consulting clients per year just to keep my mind sharp. My annual income hovered reliably around $60,000. I paid my property taxes on time, drove a clean but ordinary Honda Civic, and wore clothes from department stores rather than boutiques. I had learned, somewhere in my 40s, that the quietest wealth is the kind nobody sees. My daughter Jennifer, she went by Jenny, had always been the light of my life. When Gerald passed from a heart attack 8 years ago, it was Jenny who sat with me through the worst nights. She had her father's laugh and my stubbornness, and for a long time, I believed those two things together would protect her from most of the world's damage. She met Brad Harris at 32. He was handsome in the aggressive, practiced way of a man who knows it. He sold commercial real estate and spoke in a register that suggested he was always addressing an audience slightly larger than the one actually present. I tried to like him. I genuinely tried. At their wedding, I danced and smiled and meant most of it. But the first warning signs came quietly, as they always do. It started with small comments at family dinners. Brad would mention casually that he'd just closed a deal worth $200,000 in commission. He would glance at me after saying it, not at Jenny, at me, as though checking whether I was adequately impressed. When I responded with mild, genuine interest rather than visible awe, something behind his eyes would cool slightly. Then came the questions that weren't really questions. "Marlene, what exactly did you do before retirement again?" He asked this 3 separate times over 2 years, each time as though the answer had failed to register. I explained each time: financial consulting, portfolio management, retirement planning for private clients. He would nod in a way that meant he had already dismissed it. Jenny stopped calling me as often. When I noticed this and mentioned it gently, she said she'd been busy. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. The second warning sign was the house. Brad and Jenny bought a 4-bedroom colonial in Lake Oswego. A beautiful house, genuinely beautiful, in one of Portland's most expensive suburbs. I visited for the first time that October and admired it sincerely. Brad gave me a tour with the energy of a real estate agent who needed the commission. When I asked what their mortgage payment looked like, Jenny changed the subject quickly in a way I had never seen her do before. I noted it and said nothing. By the following spring, Brad had begun referring to me, in my presence, as Jenny's mom, rather than by my name. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The evening of the incident was a Saturday in March. Jenny had invited me for dinner, and I had come with a bottle of wine and a pot of her favorite soup I'd made from scratch. We ate in their dining room under a chandelier that I suspected cost more than my monthly grocery budget for a year. The conversation was pleasant enough on the surface until Brad asked me, in front of Jenny, whether I had considered downsizing my situation now that I was getting older. I asked him what he meant. He said, and I remember every word with the clarity of something carved, "Come on, Marlene. You live alone, you're on a fixed income, and frankly, the neighborhood you're in isn't exactly aspirational." I'm just being honest. It's a little embarrassing for Jenny, you know? Her friends ask about her family. The table went quiet. I looked at Jenny. She looked at her plate. Brad leaned back in his chair with the comfortable posture of a man who expected no real consequence and said, I think it's time you found somewhere more appropriate for your situation. The guest room arrangement isn't working for us. We need that space. I had been staying in their guest room for 4 days, having traveled from Portland for a medical appointment in their area. I put my napkin on the table. I stood up. I thanked Jenny for dinner in a voice that came out steadier than I felt. I took my overnight bag from the guest room, and I walked out of that house without raising my voice once. I drove to a Marriott 12 minutes away, sat on the edge of the bed in room 114, and stared at the wall for a very long time. I had not told either of them what my income was. I had never seen a reason to. That night, for the first time, I began to think perhaps I should have. Not to impress anyone, but so that my daughter would understand exactly what she had allowed her husband to dismiss. But impressing them was never going to be my goal. I checked out of the Marriott on Monday morning and drove back to Portland in rain so steady it felt personal. For the first 3 days back in my own house, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Not the polite, manageable kind of crying I had allowed myself after Gerald died, in controlled intervals so as not to frighten Jenny. This was different. This was the crying of someone who had finally admitted to themselves that a thing they had been calling by the wrong name for 2 years was not what they thought it was. What I had been calling Brad's rough edges was contempt. What I had been calling Jenny's busy season was distance she had allowed to grow because it was easier than standing between her husband and her mother. I sat in my kitchen in Portland, with Gerald's old armchair visible through the doorway, and I let myself understand that clearly. The grief was real. I want to be honest about that, because what came next might make it seem as though I was purely strategic, purely calculating. I wasn't. I was a 64-year-old woman who missed her daughter and was furious in the quiet way that only very patient people can be furious. But I was also, by profession and by nature, a person who counted things. So after 3 days of grief, I sat down at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I had always preferred legal pads to laptops for serious thinking, and I began to take stock. What had I actually lost? I wrote it down in 2 columns. On the left, Jenny's easy phone calls. Sunday dinners we used to share when she lived closer. The version of my daughter who looked at me as though my opinion mattered. My sense of safety in that house. 4 days of believing the guest room was still a place where I was welcome. On the right, nothing financial, nothing legal, nothing that Brad actually had the power to take. I stared at the right column for a long time. Here was what Brad Harris did not know about me. I had spent 27 years watching people make catastrophically bad financial decisions based on the assumption that other people had less money, less knowledge, and less leverage than they did. I had watched overconfident men in particular make this mistake with remarkable consistency. They saw a quiet older woman in department store clothes driving an ordinary Honda, and they calculated accordingly. They were nearly always wrong. I was not poor. I was not dependent. I was not on a fixed income in the way Brad meant it, the polite euphemism for barely getting by. I had $60,000 a year coming in from investments and consulting, a paid-off house worth $420,000 in the current Portland market, and a savings account that would have surprised him considerably. More importantly, I had helped Jenny and Brad purchase that house. This was the fact I had not fully examined until I sat down with my legal pad. 2 years ago, when they were short on the down payment, Jenny had called me. She hadn't asked Brad to call me. She had called me herself, quietly, and I had given them $40,000 as a gift. A gift, not a loan, because I loved my daughter, and I had not wanted to create a debt between us. I had not told Brad where the money came from. Jenny had handled that conversation on her end, and I had trusted her to handle it. I now wondered what she had told him, or whether she had told him anything at all. I wrote the number 40,000 on my legal pad and circled it. Not because I wanted it back, I didn't. It had been freely given. But it was a data point. It meant that the man who had looked at me over his expensive chandelier and called me an embarrassing burden had been living in part in a house purchased with my money. The irony was almost too clean. My first instinct was to call Jenny directly, to confront her, to ask her why she had sat silent while Brad spoke to me that way, to demand an apology. I picked up my phone twice. I put it down twice. Jenny would apologize. I knew she would. She would call me crying and tell me Brad hadn't meant it the way it sounded, and could I please not make this into something? And then nothing would change. I had watched that pattern in other families for decades. The apology would be real, and the dynamic would be unchanged, and I would be back in that guest room within a year, grateful to be tolerated. That was not going to be my life. What I needed was not an apology. What I needed was a restructuring. I thought about it the way I would have thought about a client's portfolio after a significant loss. You don't react emotionally to a market correction. You assess what you actually hold. You identify what is truly at risk. You protect the assets that matter. And you make deliberate moves from a position of knowledge rather than fear. My most important asset was my relationship with Jenny. That was what I was trying to protect. Not punish Brad, not vindicate myself, but recover the daughter I had been slowly losing without fully realizing it. To do that, Jenny needed to understand something she clearly did not know, that her mother was not who Brad had described. Not a burden, not a charity case, not something to be embarrassed about. And the only way to make that real to her, truly real, not just words, was to show her. My plan began to form over the following week. It was not dramatic. It was not cruel. It was the kind of plan that a careful, experienced financial professional designs, methodical, documented, and effective. The first step was simple. I needed to see, clearly and completely, what Jenny and Brad's actual financial situation looked like. Not to harm it, but to understand it. Because you cannot help someone or protect yourself from someone without accurate information. I made 2 phone calls that Friday, one to my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Webb, who had handled my estate planning for 11 years, one to an old colleague who now worked in mortgage compliance. I told Patricia I needed to review my estate documents. I told my colleague I had some questions about property records. Neither conversation was unusual. Neither raised any flags. But both conversations I knew were going to change everything. Patricia Webb's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Portland, with a view of the Willamette River that had always calmed me. I had been coming to this office for 11 years, and Patricia had that particular quality I most respect in attorneys. She listened more than she spoke. I sat across from her on a Tuesday morning in late March, with my legal pad and a folder of documents I had compiled over the previous week. Outside the window, the river moved in its unhurried way, and I thought, not for the first time, that rivers understand something about patience that most people don't. I want to review my will, I told Patricia, and I want to understand all of my options. She looked at me over her reading glasses with the careful neutrality of someone who had heard this sentence preceded by many different kinds of stories. "Tell me what's happened," she said. I told her. Not emotionally. I had already spent my emotional energy on the legal pad and the 3 days of crying. I gave her the facts, the dinner, Brad's words, my $40,000 gift that Brad appeared not to know about, and my concern that my daughter was making financial decisions inside a marriage where important information was being withheld or distorted. Patricia was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "The 40,000. You have documentation of that transfer?" "Bank records. A letter I wrote to Jenny at the time explaining it was a gift with no expectation of repayment, sent by certified mail." She nodded slowly. "And you believe Brad was unaware of the source of those funds?" "I believe Jenny may have told him it came from savings she had before the marriage, or from Gerald's estate, or possibly not explained it at all." "I don't know. That's partly what I need to understand." Patricia pulled out a legal pad of her own. We are both legal pad women, and I had always found that reassuring. Over the next 90 minutes, we went through my estate documents line by line. My existing will left everything equally to Jenny and to two charitable foundations Gerald and I had supported for years. Patricia walked me through my options. I could modify the will. I could establish a trust that Jenny could benefit from under specific conditions. I could make no changes and simply document my concerns. She did not recommend any particular path. That was not her job. Her job was to make sure I understood what I held. What I held was considerable. The house, the investments, the savings, the consulting income. Together, it represented a estate Patricia estimated conservatively at just over $800,000. I let that number sit in the room for a moment. "Brad called me a financial burden," I said. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something around her eyes did. "People make assumptions," she said carefully. "They do," I agreed. I left her office with an appointment to return in 2 weeks and a growing sense of clarity that felt physically like a loosening in my chest. The second development came not from my attorney, but from my mortgage compliance colleague, a man named David Cho, who I had worked alongside in the early 2000s. I had asked him, as a favor, to walk me through how to read a property record for a Lake Oswego address. I was not asking him to do anything improper. Property records in Oregon are public documents, accessible to anyone. I simply wanted a professional to help me interpret what I was looking at. What David found, and what I had not expected, was a second mortgage. Brad and Jenny's property had a home equity line of credit opened 14 months ago for $120,000. It had been drawn down by approximately $89,000. David pulled the filing dates and the lender information as a matter of public record and walked me through what it meant. They had borrowed heavily against the house recently, and the payment schedule was aggressive. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I allowed myself to draw any conclusions. Then I called Jenny. She answered on the second ring, slightly breathless, with the particular quality in her voice that meant she was somewhere public and was moderating herself. "Mom." "Hi, I've been meaning to call you." "I know," I said. "I'd like to have lunch, just the two of us. Can you come to Portland this weekend?" A pause. "Brad and I were going to—" "Jenny." I kept my voice gentle. Not cold, not pointed. Gentle. Just lunch. Just us. She came. We sat at a cafe on Northwest 23rd that we had been going to since she was in college, in a corner booth with good light, and I ordered us both the soup she had always liked. I did not begin with accusations. I began with a question. "When you and Brad bought the house," I said, "what did you tell him about where the down payment money came from?" The color in Jenny's face shifted in a way that told me everything before she said a single word. Her eyes moved to the window, then back to me, and she pressed her lips together in a way I recognized from when she was 9 years old and had broken something she hadn't meant to break. "I told him it was money I'd saved," she said quietly. "Your own savings?" "Yes." I nodded. I didn't say anything for a moment. I poured us both more water. Why? I asked finally. She looked at her hands. Because Brad has opinions about accepting money from family. He would have felt diminished. I didn't want to start a fight before we'd even moved in. So he has spent 2 years believing he bought that house largely on his own. Mom. And he spent one of those 2 years telling me, in various ways, that I was not successful enough to merit his respect. I said it quietly, without heat. Do you see the problem, Jenny? She was crying by then, quietly, in the way she had learned to cry in adulthood, contained, ashamed of the crying itself. I handed her a napkin and waited. I didn't know he was going to say those things, she whispered. I know you didn't, I said, but he said them, and you sat there. That was the moment I knew there was no going back to the version of this relationship that had existed before. The question was only what version came next. 2 weeks after my lunch with Jenny, I sat in Patricia's office again, and we made it official. I won't reproduce the legal language here because it wasn't the language that mattered. It was the intention behind it. What I did was this. I restructured my estate into a revocable living trust. Gerald's name came off the old documents and mine was reaffirmed as the sole trustee. The beneficiary structure changed as well. Jenny remained a beneficiary, but the trust now included a professional trustee provision, meaning that any disbursements above a certain threshold required review by Patricia's firm, not just a signature from whoever Jenny happened to be married to at the time. I also did something simpler and more immediate. I wrote a formal letter on my own letterhead, documenting the $40,000 gift made 2 years prior, the certified mail record of its original delivery, and the fact that this money had constituted a significant portion of the down payment on the Harris family home in Lake Oswego. I had Patricia notarize it, and we filed a copy with her firm. This letter did not create a legal claim. I was not trying to recover the money. What it created was a clear, dated, official record of fact, the kind of record that is very difficult to rewrite later. Patricia did not ask me why I was doing this. She was too professional for that. But as I was gathering my coat to leave, she said almost to herself, "You know, in 30 years of estate work, the people who plan quietly are usually the ones who needed to the least." I thought about that on the drive home. I had been home for 4 days when Brad called. It was a Thursday evening, just after 7. I was making dinner, a simple pasta, the kind you make when you're thinking about other things, and my phone buzzed on the counter with Brad's name on the screen. I had not given him my number. Jenny must have. Jenny. I turned down the heat on the stove and answered, "Marlene." His voice had the particular quality of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say, but is already slightly off the script he rehearsed. "I think we need to talk about whatever it is you're doing." "Good evening, Brad," I said. "Jenny told me about your lunch. And I've heard from a mutual friend that you've been making inquiries about our property." I noted the word "our." I noted the word inquiries. It was meant to sound accusatory, and it didn't. Public property records are not private correspondence. Anyone can look at them. "I reviewed public records, yes," I said calmly. "Property records in Oregon are available to anyone." "I want to know what your angle is." His voice tightened. "You show up at my house, as a guest, I'll remind you, and then you go running off and start making inquiries like some kind of—" "Brad." I kept my voice level. "I came to your house at Jenny's invitation, as I had done many times before. You told me I was an embarrassment and asked me to leave. I left. I didn't make a scene. I didn't call Jenny upset. And I didn't do anything that night except drive to a hotel and pay for my own room. Everything I have done since then has been entirely within my legal rights as an adult managing her own affairs." Silence. Then, "Are you planning to cause problems for us?" Because I'll tell you right now, Marlene, if you're thinking about making some kind of claim on the house, I have made no claim on the house, I said. I gifted money to my daughter 2 years ago. It was a gift. I have no interest in recovering it. I paused. However, I do think you should speak with Jenny about where that money actually came from. Another silence. Longer this time, and with a different quality. The kind of silence that happens when a person is recalculating. What does that mean? He said. It means you should speak with Jenny, I repeated. I think that's a conversation the two of you need to have without me. He tried twice more to push me towards something. A fight, a concession, a reaction he could use. I gave him none of them. By the end of the call, he was not shouting, but there was something frantic underneath his controlled tone, a note of a man who is used to being the one with the information and has just realized he may not be. I think we're done for tonight, I said. Good night, Brad. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment. The pasta had slightly overcooked. I ate it anyway. Jenny called 20 minutes later, crying, asking me what I had said to Brad. I told her, calmly and completely, exactly what I had said. Every word. I asked her to tell me if any of it was untrue. She couldn't say that it was. He's very upset, she said. I understand that, I said. I was very upset 3 weeks ago in your dining room. These things happen. Mom, please don't. Jenny. I kept the gentleness in my voice because I meant it. I love you. Nothing I am doing is about hurting you. But I am not going to pretend the last month didn't happen. And I am not going to manage Brad's feelings at the expense of the truth. That has to be his job. She was quiet for a long time after that. After I hung up, I recognized in myself a specific kind of exhaustion. Not the tired feeling of defeat, but the tired feeling of having done something hard correctly. I took the next 3 days for myself. I went for long walks along the river. I called an old friend from my consulting days and had a 2-hour lunch that had nothing to do with any of this. I slept deeply, which surprised me. I needed that rest because I knew Brad Harris was not finished. The offer came through Jenny, as I had expected it would. It was a Sunday afternoon, about 10 days after my call with Brad. I was in my garden. Gerald had started that garden and I had kept it going for 8 years, mostly out of loyalty to the idea of it, when my phone rang. Jenny's voice had the rehearsed quality that told me she had talked through the conversation with Brad before making the call. Mom, Brad and I have been talking, she began, and we think maybe we all got off on the wrong foot. Brad wants me to tell you that he's sorry if his words came across the wrong way at dinner. He didn't mean for you to feel unwelcome. I pulled a weed from the base of a rose bush and waited. And we were thinking, if you're willing to let this go, move past it. We'd love to have you at the house again. Brad is even talking about the summer. We could do a real visit, a proper one. There it was. The architecture of the offer was elegant in a simple way. An apology that was not an apology, if his words came across the wrong way. Paired with a reward for accepting it, a summer invitation. Paired with an implicit condition, if you're willing to let this go. It was the kind of offer designed to make the recipient feel that accepting it was their idea. I had reviewed enough financial documents in my life to recognize the structure of a bad deal. I appreciate you calling, Jenny, I said. Tell me, does Brad know yet about where the down payment came from? A pause. We've talked. And? He's processing it. I nodded to myself. Which meant he was angry at Jenny, and a summer invitation to the woman he was angry at Jenny for lying about was, in all likelihood, Brad's way of controlling the narrative before I could define it myself. I'm not planning anything that needs to be let go, I said carefully. I'm managing my own finances and my own estate, as I have been doing for 30 years. That's not a threat to anyone. What I won't do is pretend that the conversation in March didn't happen. because it did. Mom, I'm being clear, I said. There's a difference. I love you. I'm not going anywhere. But I'm also not going to walk back into that dynamic as though nothing happened. We said goodbye with the careful politeness of people who are on the same side but currently standing in different rooms. After I hung up, I sat on the garden bench for a while and thought about how strange it is that the people who most need you to absorb their bad behavior are always the ones who frame the refusal to do so as aggression on your part. That afternoon, I walked next door to see my neighbor, Carol Anderson, who had been my closest friend in Portland for 14 years. Carol was a retired high school principal, the kind of woman who had seen every form of human manipulation available to a 16-year-old and had developed a near-clinical eye for it. I had not told her the full story yet because I had not been ready to say it out loud to someone who knew me well. I told her over coffee on her back porch. Carol listened without interrupting, which was her great gift. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The thing that gets me is the down payment. He sat in that house every day for 2 years and looked down at the woman who helped him buy it. He didn't know," I said. "He didn't know because it was convenient for him not to ask," Carol said. She had the directness of someone who has spent decades with adolescents and has no patience for self-deception in any form. That's different from innocent ignorance, Marlene. A man who respects the people around him asks questions. I hadn't framed it that way to myself, and hearing it framed that way mattered. The following Wednesday, I had a long phone call with my old colleague, Ruth Brennan, who had spent 35 years in family financial consulting before retiring to Tucson. Ruth was one of 3 people in the world I trusted with the specific texture of a complicated situation. I told her everything: the dinner, my estate restructuring, the public record review, Brad's call, and Jenny's offer. Ruth was quiet for a moment at the end, and then she said something I have thought about many times since. "Marlene, the most important thing you've done isn't the legal stuff. It's that you didn't react in the moment. You gave yourself time to be strategic instead of emotional. That's actually very rare." "I cried for 3 days first," I pointed out. "That's not emotional," Ruth said. "That's processing. There's a difference. What people call emotional decisions are usually the ones made before processing is done." Carol from the garden bench and Ruth from Tucson, together, gave me something I hadn't realized I needed: the external confirmation that I was not being vindictive, not being paranoid, not imagining the scale of what had happened. I was responding rationally to something genuinely unreasonable. Sometimes you need people who knew you before an incident to tell you that you're still yourself. I went to bed that Sunday with a specific kind of calm, not happiness exactly, but the sturdy feeling of someone who has solid ground under them and knows it. They showed up on a Saturday morning in May, which told me the visit had been planned rather than impulsive. Brad did not do unplanned things. He arrived at my door in a linen shirt and an expression of studied warmth, carrying a bottle of wine that was nicer than anything he had ever brought to my house before, which itself was a kind of information. Jenny was behind him, wearing the expression of someone who has been briefed extensively and is trying very hard to perform natural. I let them in because Jenny was my daughter, and I was not going to refuse to open my door. I offered coffee because I was raised to offer coffee. We sat in my living room, the room with Gerald's armchair, the watercolor of the Oregon coast that Jenny had given me for my 60th birthday, the reading lamp that had been in my family since the 1970s. My home, my space. Brad led, as I had known he would. "Marlene, I owe you an apology." He said it cleanly, with good eye contact, and if I hadn't known him for 3 years, I might have found it entirely convincing. The things I said in March were inappropriate. I was under a lot of stress with work, and I took it out in a way that was wrong. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," I said. A beat of surprise from him. He had expected more resistance, or perhaps gratitude, or perhaps tears. He recalibrated. Jenny and I have been talking, and we want to move forward as a family. We think it's important. I agree it's important, I said. Another beat. He was looking for the catch in my tone. He had taught himself to look for it in others by deploying it so often himself. There's something else, Jenny said, and her voice was careful in the way of someone who knows they are approaching a difficult terrain. She reached into her bag and produced a piece of paper, printed, not handwritten, that she placed on the coffee table between us. Brad's attorney put this together. It's just a clarification about the family financial arrangements going forward. I picked it up and read it. It was functionally a document asking me to confirm in writing that I had no claims against the Harris property, that the $40,000 transfer was unconditional and unrecoverable, and, buried in the third paragraph in slightly smaller font, that my estate planning arrangements would not be modified in a manner that disadvantaged Jennifer Harris without 60 days written notice to her spouse. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the coffee table, gently, face up, and looked at Brad. Who drafted this? I asked. My attorney, he said. It's standard family financial. No, I said. It isn't. This is not a standard document. This requires me to notify your spouse before modifying my own will. I tapped the third paragraph. I am asking who specifically drafted this. His jaw tightened slightly. I told you, my attorney, Brad. I kept my voice entirely neutral. I am a retired financial consultant. I have spent 30 years reading documents exactly like this one. This clause, I tapped it again, is not about clarity. It is about control. It is asking me to treat my son-in-law as a legal party to my estate planning. He is not a legal party to my estate planning. He has no standing in my estate. This document is asking me to voluntarily create standing where none exists. The room was very quiet. Brad's studied warmth evaporated. Not slowly. It went quickly, like a screen switching off. What replaced it was the real face, the one I had seen glimpses of at dinner tables and over phone calls. Impatient, calculating, and fundamentally unaccustomed to being countered by someone he had classified as beneath him. Do you understand what you're doing? He said, and his voice had dropped into a register I recognized as the one people use when they are no longer bothering to perform civility. You're choosing to make this into a conflict. You are deliberately trying to destabilize our marriage and our finances, and when this comes out, and it will come out, you will be the one who looks unreasonable. When what comes out? I asked. The fact that you're manipulating your own estate to punish Jenny for her husband's one bad night. I haven't punished anyone, I said. I have made legal updates to my own estate documents. That is my right. It is also, incidentally, something I should have done 3 years ago when Gerald's estate was settled. So in some ways, Brad, you've been useful. You reminded me that my paperwork needed updating. Jenny made a small sound, not quite a laugh, suppressed immediately. Brad stood up. He was a tall man, and he used his height deliberately in that moment, standing in my living room in a way that was meant to compress the space around me. I want you to understand, he said, that if you continue down this path, you will lose your daughter. I will make sure of that. I sat in my chair and looked up at him and felt something happen in my chest. A cold, clear sensation that I can only describe as the feeling of something becoming very simple. No, I said. You won't. You don't know Brad. I stood up then, not to match his height, but because I was done being looked down at. You are a man who has spent 3 years dismissing me because you assumed you knew what I was worth. You assumed I was dependent. You assumed I had nothing. You based an entire strategy on a set of facts that were wrong. I picked up the document from the coffee table and held it out to him. Take this back to your attorney. Do not send anything like this to me again without going through Patricia Webb's office. He took the paper. His hand, I noticed, was not entirely steady. Jenny watched all of this without saying a single word. They left 2 minutes later. Brad walked out first. Jenny paused at the door and turned back, and for a moment, the rehearsed expression was gone completely, and she looked exactly like the daughter I had been missing for 2 years. She looked frightened and very young. "Mom," she started. "I know," I said. "I know." After the door closed, I stood in my entry hall and breathed. There was fear in my body. I won't pretend there wasn't. Brad's threat about losing Jenny was not a nothing. It was the thing that most had the power to land. But the fear, when I examined it, felt strangely like fuel. Because a man who threatens you with the loss of your daughter when you won't sign away your legal rights is not a man who is confident. He is a man who has just understood that the things he was counting on don't exist. I went to the kitchen, made tea, and called Carol. The meeting at Patricia's office happened on a Thursday afternoon in June, and I had been preparing for it for 3 weeks. I want to explain how it was arranged, because the manner of the arrangement mattered. I did not ambush anyone. I did not manufacture a crisis. I called Jenny and told her I would like to have a formal conversation, with her and Brad present at my attorney's office, to put on record the current understanding of family financial matters and to give everyone, including Jenny, complete information about their own situation. Jenny said she would have to talk to Brad. Brad, to my mild surprise, agreed. I think he agreed because he believed the meeting would be an opportunity for his attorney's document to be revisited, and because he was the kind of man who trusted his own ability to perform confidence in a room. He arrived at Patricia's office in a suit that was slightly too warm for the June weather, with a folder of his own documents and the posture of someone who expects to be in charge. Patricia and I were already seated when they arrived. The room was calm, adequately lit, professionally ordinary, the kind of room where important things get decided in undramatic ways. Patricia opened by explaining the ground rules. This was an informational meeting, not a legal proceeding. No one was required to be here. Nothing would be filed today, and anyone was free to leave at any time. She kept her tone entirely neutral, as she always did. Then I spoke. "I asked for this meeting," I said, "because I think Jenny deserves to have complete information about her family's financial situation. All of it, including information she may not currently have." Brad's eyes moved to me with a quality of sharpness that told me he was already adjusting his strategy. I began with the gift. I placed the notarized letter on the table, the one documenting the $40,000 transfer 2 years prior, and slid it to Jenny. She picked it up and read it. As she read, something in her face went very still. "You know about this," I said to her gently. "I just want it documented, formally, that this money, which represented approximately half of your down payment, came from me, not from your savings, not from Gerald's estate. From me." Jenny nodded. Her eyes were focused on the letter. "Brad," I said, "I don't know what Jenny told you at the time. I assume from our phone conversation in April that you may not have known the full picture." Brad's jaw was set. "This is already documented," he said. "We don't need to—" "The second thing I want to share," I said, "is this." I placed the public property record on the table, the HELOC filing, the drawdown amount, the payment schedule. Jenny looked at it. Brad did not reach for it. "This is publicly available information," I said. "It's your home equity line of credit, opened 14 months ago. You've drawn down $89,000 against it." I paused. "Jenny, were you involved in that decision?" The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long. It felt much longer. Jenny's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "I signed something. I thought it was a refinancing." Brad's composure held for another moment. Impressive, really, given what was happening. And then it didn't. "This is completely inappropriate," he said, pushing back slightly from the table. You have no right to come in here and interrogate my wife about our— I'm not interrogating anyone, I said. I'm presenting public documents in front of a licensed attorney at a meeting everyone here agreed to attend. Jenny asked what she signed. I think that's a reasonable question. Jenny is my wife and our finances are— Brad. It was Patricia who spoke, in the steady, measured tone of someone who has redirected many conversations in this room. This information is all publicly accessible. No law has been violated. Please allow Marlene to finish. I watched Brad in that moment the way I had watched difficult clients during very hard conversations, with genuine attention and without pleasure. I was not enjoying his discomfort. What I was watching for was what he did with it, because how a person behaves when their control is removed is the clearest picture of who they actually are. What he did was reach for anger. You've been planning this, he said to me, and his voice had lost the last of its professional veneer. This whole thing, the attorney, the estate, the records, this is a coordinated attack on my marriage and my— Brad. Jenny's voice was so quiet it nearly disappeared into the room. Where did the $89,000 go? He stopped. She looked at him with an expression I recognized. Not anger, not tears, but the particular expression of someone who has just understood that a question they have been afraid to ask has an answer they are going to have to live with. The money, she said, from the equity line. Where did it go? I said nothing. Patricia said nothing. This was not our conversation to have. Brad's eyes moved around the room, to me, to Patricia, to the documents, to Jenny. A man recalculating in real time. He had come into this room believing he was the one with the knowledge and the leverage, and in the space of 40 minutes that had been methodically and completely reversed. Some of it was investments, he said finally. Some was for the business. There were expenses. You told me we were building equity, Jenny said. We are building equity, the market fluctuates. You told me we were building equity and you borrowed against the house without telling me what for. In 27 years of sitting in rooms with people during financially difficult conversations, I had learned this. The truth doesn't arrive like lightning. It arrives the way water gets into a foundation. Slowly, through the small cracks that were always there, until one day the wall is simply wet. Jenny was looking at the wall. Brad stopped talking. I placed the last document on the table, the updated trust summary prepared by Patricia, showing the structure of my estate as it now stood. I didn't explain it at length. I simply made sure Jenny could see it. This is my estate, I said. It's structured so that you are protected, Jenny, regardless of what happens in your marriage. It cannot be touched, transferred, or influenced by anyone except through the trust's independent trustee. That's not a punishment. It's a protection. Jenny looked at the document. Then she looked at me with the eyes of a 36-year-old woman who was seeing her mother clearly, possibly for the first time in several years. Brad said nothing. The meeting ended quietly, the way important things often do. The weeks after the meeting at Patricia's office were not dramatic. That is the thing about real consequences. They rarely announce themselves. They arrive in the mail, in bank notifications, in the tone of a voice on a phone call that used to sound confident. The first thing that happened was that Jenny called me, not crying, not panicked, just called on a Tuesday evening and said she had made an appointment with her own attorney. Good, I said. I don't know what I'm going to do, she said. I want you to know that. I don't have a plan. You don't need one yet, I said. That's what the appointment is for. She was quiet. I keep thinking about the down payment. Don't, I said. That money was given freely. It doesn't change what I want for you. I lied to him about where it came from, she said. I know I did. I was afraid of how he would react, and I made a bad decision. You made a human decision, I said. People make those when they're afraid. The question is what you do when the fear runs out. Jenny's attorney was a woman named Diane Cho, no relation to my colleague David, who worked in family law in Lake Oswego. I know this because Jenny told me, and because I later learned that Diane was known in legal circles for being exceptionally thorough with financial disclosures in marital cases. This turned out to matter. The HELOC situation was, financially, worse than the public records had suggested. Diane's discovery process, once Jenny engaged her formally, uncovered that Brad had been using the equity funds to support a series of speculative real estate side investments separate from his brokerage work, at least 2 of which had failed. The $89,000 was not building equity. It was gone. I learned this from Jenny over several conversations. I did not celebrate when she told me. What I felt was a specific, sad kind of vindication. The feeling of someone who had suspected a thing for a long time and had not wanted to be right. Brad's brokerage employer became involved when Diane's process surfaced questions about whether any of the speculative investments had involved client-adjacent conflicts. I don't know the full details, and I won't speculate about what I don't know. What I do know is that by September, Brad had left the firm and was no longer in Lake Oswego. The beautiful house, the colonial with the chandelier that cost more than my annual grocery budget, went on the market in October. Between the mortgage, the HELOC payments, and the other liabilities, there was very little equity remaining. Jenny received a portion of the sale proceeds that was smaller than she had expected. She also received in the settlement the documentation that confirmed what she had suspected, that the financial situation in her marriage had been, in fundamental ways, withheld from her. I did not say, "I told you so," at any point. I want to be precise about that. Not because I am a saint, I am not, but because Jenny had not needed someone to tell her something. She had needed someone to help her see it clearly. There is a difference. What I did instead was practical. When Jenny found a smaller apartment in Portland, close to me, as it turned out, close enough that I could see her kitchen light from my driveway, I helped her move in. I bought her a kitchen table because she needed one, and I had been meaning to replace mine anyway, and we chose it together on a Saturday at a furniture store on Powell Boulevard and argued amiably about whether a round table or a rectangular one made more sense for a one-bedroom, and she laughed for the first time in I didn't know how long, and I thought, there she is. My estate remained structured as Patricia and I had arranged it. I made no further changes. No punishments. No modifications intended to harm Brad, because there was nothing left to structure against. Brad Harris had managed, largely on his own, to do what Brad Harris does: overextend, overrepresent, and underdeliver. Jenny's name was still in my trust. It had always been there. What was also there, now, was a trustee structure that meant her inheritance could not be controlled, borrowed against, or leveraged by a future spouse without independent review. That was not punishment. That was wisdom, applied retroactively. In November, I had dinner with Patricia, who told me, as we finished our wine, that she had sent several clients to Diane Cho in the past year and had always found her thorough. "You sent Jenny to Diane?" I asked. Patricia looked at me with the expression of a woman who has spent 30 years in estate law and knows precisely how to answer a question with a non-transferable smile. I thanked her for dinner and drove home in the kind of evening that feels specifically like autumn in Portland, dark and clean and smelling of rain, and sat in Gerald's armchair and felt something I had not felt since March. The uncomplicated kind of tired. The kind that comes after something is finished. By the following spring, my life had resettled into something that felt, in most of the ways that mattered, better than before. Jenny and I had dinner on Thursday evenings. It had started naturally. She came over one Thursday in January to borrow a pasta pot and stayed for dinner. And then the following Thursday, she brought wine. And by March, it had simply become the thing we did on Thursdays. We cooked together in my kitchen and talked about her work. She had gone back to nonprofit administration and found she was very good at it, which surprised her and didn't surprise me at all. When we talked about Brad, she spoke with the matter-of-fact clarity of a person who understood what they had been inside and how they had gotten out. Brad Harris had relocated to Phoenix. He was no longer in commercial real estate. The circumstances of his departure from the Lake Oswego firm had made that difficult in Oregon. Last I heard, he was working in sales for a home warranty company. The irony of a man who had once given tours of a 4-bedroom colonial now selling home warranties was not lost on me, though I kept that observation for Carol, who appreciated it enormously. The speculative investments he had made with the equity funds were unrecoverable. That was the most complete consequence of his behavior. Not anything I had done, but the simple mathematical reality that a man who borrows against his house to fund investments he hides from his wife tends to arrive at a reckoning entirely of his own design. Carol and I kept our Saturday garden walks. I took on 2 new consulting clients and found I still enjoyed the work as much as I ever had. I turned 65 that October. Jenny and Carol and Ruth, who drove up from Tucson specifically, had dinner at my house. Ruth gave a toast that was generous and slightly embarrassing. Jenny held my hand at the end of the evening in a way that required no words. I cut a small bunch of Gerald's roses in August and put them in a vase on the kitchen table where the notarized letter had once sat. The sun came in through the window, and the roses were an ordinary pink, and I was 65 years old, and fine. I had my daughter back. I had my house, my legal pad, my late husband's armchair, and a kitchen that smelled like pasta on Thursday evenings. A man in Phoenix was selling home warranties. Equilibrium, I have found, is not a dramatic thing. It is exactly as quiet as it looks. I started this story with a dinner table, a chandelier, and a man who called me an embarrassment. I want to end it with the thing I already knew, but had to live again to remember. Quiet strength is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. The most effective thing I did that year wasn't dramatic or loud. It was sitting at a kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and counting what I actually held. People who underestimate you are not your burden to correct. They correct themselves eventually, with your help or without it. If someone had treated you the way Brad treated me, what would you have done? I'd love to know your answer in the comments. If this story meant something to you, please share it. Someone out there needs to hear it today. Thank you for listening.